It is a beautiful, quiet morning on the water. You tie on that brand new $40 swim bait you just bought. You make a perfect cast right next to a giant fallen tree. You reel down, feeling the vibration, expecting a massive bite. But instead, your rod stops dead. You are stuck tight on a sunken log. What is the very first thing you do? Do you yank the rod back as hard as you can? Do you try to muscle it out? If you just nodded your head, you are completely destroying your own chances of getting that lure back. Today, we are talking about the number one mistake you are making when your lure gets snagged. It is a mistake that goes against everything your grandfather taught you about fishing. By the end of this video, you will realize that the very instinct you rely on to save your lure is exactly what seals its fate. Let us find out why you are actively throwing your money away every time you get stuck. Getting snagged is the universal tax we all pay as fishermen. If you are not getting snagged occasionally, you are simply not throwing your bait where the fish actually live. Fish love heavy cover, wood, rocks, and weeds. But over the years, a terrible habit has been passed down through generations of anglers. We are taught that fishing is a battle of strength. When a hook gets stuck, our human brain panics. We feel resistance, and our immediate primitive response is to pull back with maximum force. We think that if we just pull hard enough, the branch will break, or the hook will bend, and our precious lure will fly free. We do this exact same thing for decades, ignoring the snapped rods, the ruined line, and the empty tackle boxes. We blame the heavy cover instead of our own flawed reaction. It is time to step back, look at the actual physics of a snag, and understand why brute force is the enemy of a smart angler. Picture this exact scenario. It is a calm afternoon at your local pond. You are working a heavy jig slowly across the bottom, feeling every single rock and pebble. Suddenly the jig stops moving. It feels heavy and solid. You think it is a big bass sucking up the bait, so you swing hard and set the hook with all your might. But nothing moves. The line goes incredibly tight, the rod bends over double, but there is zero head shake. You are not fighting a trophy fish. You are fighting a massive oak stump sitting on the bottom. If you are like 99% of the fishermen out there, your immediate reaction is to give the rod another massive, angry yank. You pull back as hard as you can, hoping to rip the jig right out of the wood. This instant, aggressive reaction is the absolute number one mistake you can make. Instead of freeing the bait, you are actively sealing its fate. You are taking a very minor problem and turning it into a guaranteed disaster. We have all stood on the bank feeling that awful, sinking realization that our favorite bait is completely trapped. But understanding what actually happens underwater the moment you decide to yank, that rod is absolutely crucial to saving your gear. Let us break down exactly what happens underwater when you make that aggressive pull. Imagine the extremely sharp points of your treble hooks barely resting against the side of a sunken log. When your crankbait first stops moving, chances are only the very microscopic tip of one single hook is actually touching the wood. It is barely scratched into the bark. If you were to simply let go of the reel handle immediately, the natural buoyancy of the lure might cause it to float backward and free itself instantly. But when you panic and pull back hard on the rod, you apply massive pressure directly to that tiny hook point. You literally force the barb of the hook deep into the solid grain of the wet wood. You are essentially using your expensive fishing rod like a hammer to drive a metal nail into a board. The harder you pull backward, the deeper the hook goes into the stump. What started as a simple surface snag is now a permanently embedded piece of metal. You have taken a situation that could be solved with zero effort and turned it into a permanent donation to the bottom of the lake. Stop relying on brute force and start thinking about the actual mechanics of the snag. Now we absolutely must talk about the equipment you are holding in your hands. A good quality fishing rod is a finely tuned, highly sensitive instrument. It is designed to cast very light weights, feel subtle underwater vibrations, and absorb the dynamic shock of a fighting fish. It is absolutely not designed to be used as a tow rope. When you get snagged on a rock and decide to haul back with all your body weight, you are putting your rod in extreme danger. You are forcing the graphite or fiberglass blank to bend in entirely unnatural ways. If you pull the rod back past a 90-degree angle while the line is completely stuck, you are creating a massive, dangerous stress point near the delicate tip. This awful habit is called high sticking, and it is the absolute fastest way to snap a $200 fishing rod into two useless pieces. We see it happen all the time on the water. A guy gets stuck, he gets incredibly frustrated, he points the rod to the sky, and he pulls with all his might. You hear a loud crack. Now he has lost his favorite $20 lure and absolutely destroyed his most expensive rod. Never use your rod as a crowbar to free a stuck bait. The terrible abuse does not stop with your fishing rod. Your fishing reel is also taking a massive, destructive beating when you make this critical mistake. Think about the tiny, precision-cut gears, the delicate bearings, and the smooth drag system inside your reel. They are engineered specifically to handle the pulling power of a swimming fish, which is a soft and yielding force. A fish pulls, the drag slips safely, and the rod bends. It is a system built entirely on give and take, but a giant boulder or a sunken log does not give an inch. It is a static, totally immovable object. When you lock down your drag system and crank the reel handle forcefully against a solid snag, you are applying extreme, damaging torque to the main gear and the pinion gear. You can literally shear the metal teeth right off the gears inside your reel. You might hear a horrible crunching noise and suddenly your buttery smooth reel feels like an old coffee grinder. If you are using heavy braided line, the tight line can dig incredibly deep into the spool, burying itself under the outer layers and causing an absolute nightmare of a tangle on your very next cast. So if pulling hard and cranking the reel is the absolute worst possible thing you can do, what is the correct reaction? The major secret lies in doing the exact opposite of what your natural instincts tell you to do. The very moment you feel your lure hit a solid object and stop dead, you must instantly give it total slack. Do not set the hook. Do not pull back even 1 inch. Instantly push your rod tip forward, point it straight at the water, and let the fishing line go completely limp. This is incredibly difficult to train yourself to do. Our human brains are hardwired to pull forcefully against any sudden resistance. But creating instant slack line is the true secret of elite professional anglers. Why does this simple trick work so well? Because of gravity and the natural buoyancy of your fishing lure. If you are fishing a crankbait with a floating plastic body, giving it absolute slack allows the lure to literally float backward and upward, backing itself cleanly out of the snag. The sharp hooks that were just touching the wood suddenly fall away freely. The absolute first step to saving your expensive lure is simply doing nothing. Drop the rod tip and wait a few seconds. If the simple slackline method does not work, it is time to move on to a slightly more proactive technique. But remember, it is still not about pulling hard. It is about aggressively snapping the line. This is famously known everywhere as the bow and arrow technique, and it is arguably the greatest snag-clearing trick in the entire history of fishing. Here is how you execute it correctly. First, reel up the loose line until it is relatively tight, but do not bend the rod blank very much. Point your rod tip directly down the line toward the underwater snag. Now, with your opposite hand, grab the tight line somewhere between the reel and the very first guide on the rod. Pull the line directly backward, pulling it away from the reel, exactly like you are drawing back the string on a hunting bow. The rod tip will bend just a little bit. You want to build up a good amount of heavy tension in the line you are holding, but keep the rod itself pointing straight at the stuck lure. When you have the line pulled back incredibly tight, simply open your fingers and let it slip out. Snap it hard. You are sending a massive shockwave of pure energy straight down the line. To truly master the amazing bow and arrow trick, you must deeply understand the tiny nuances of the technique. It is not just a blind, angry snap of the line. The real key to making it work perfectly is leaving just a tiny fraction of an inch of slack at the very end of the line right before the shockwave hits the bait. If the line is perfectly tight when the energy wave reaches the lure has absolutely nowhere to go. It remains completely pinned against the submerged wood. But if you quickly drop the rod tip forward just 1 single inch, right as you release the tight line from your fingers, you create a momentary pocket of loose line underwater. The fast shockwave travels down, violently hits the heavy lure, and the lure uses that split second of loose slack to bounce backward incredibly hard. You might need to perform this rapid snapping motion 3 or 4 times in a row. Snap it, give slack, snap it, give slack. It is a specific rhythm. Think of it exactly like trying to carefully vibrate a stuck key out of a rusty lock. You are not forcing it with brute strength, you are vibrating it free with physics. Now we absolutely must pause and talk about the severe physical danger associated with pulling on snagged lures. This is especially true when you are trying to pull a snag free from a very short distance. Modern fishing lures are essentially heavy pieces of lead or hard plastic armed with multiple razor-sharp treble hooks. When a heavy lure is stuck under extreme line tension, it instantly becomes a loaded, dangerous missile. If the underwater branch suddenly breaks or the tiny hook suddenly tears free from the soft wood, all of that pent-up kinetic energy releases in a fraction of a second. The lure will launch out of the water directly back at your face at speeds that can literally break bones or permanently blind you. Countless fishermen have unfortunately lost an eye, chipped their front teeth, or ended up in the local emergency room with a rusty treble hook buried deep in their cheek, simply because they pulled straight back on a snagged lure. This is exactly why you must never pull a bad snag directly toward your face. Always turn your head completely away. Hold the rod off to the far side of your body. Always wear polarized safety glasses to protect your precious vision. If you are fishing from the bank and the lure is firmly wedged under a rock, your own 2 feet are actually your absolute best tool. One of the most common and foolish mistakes is standing in the exact same spot on the shore and repeatedly yanking the rod from the exact same angle. When a jig gets wedged tightly into a V-shaped crack in a big rock, pulling from the same front direction only wedges the lead head in much tighter. The geometry of the snag is working completely against you. The solution is incredibly simple but very often completely overlooked. You must walk. Give the line plenty of generous slack, open the bail on your reel, and start walking directly down the muddy shoreline. Walk 30 or 40 yards to the far left or to the far right if the terrain allows you to do so. By simply moving your physical position, you completely alter the angle of the tight line. Now, when you finally apply pressure, you are pulling the stuck lure sideways instead of straight forward. Very often, a bait that is totally, hopelessly wedged from the front will simply slide out completely effortlessly when gently pulled from a sharp side angle. For those of you lucky enough to be fishing from a boat or a modern fishing kayak, you possess a massive advantage when it comes to changing your pulling angles. You have the total freedom to go completely to the opposite side of the stubborn snag. If you are casting directly toward the shallow shoreline and get hung up on a sunken log, your boat allows you to perform the ultimate rescue maneuver. Instead of angrily fighting it from where you initially cast, drop your rod tip, hit the trolling motor button, and quietly drive your boat directly over and completely past the snagged lure. You want to keep the fishing line relatively loose and out of the way as you move. Once your boat is safely on the complete opposite side of the submerged stump, you simply pull the line from the opposite direction. Because you cast the lure into the front of the snag, pulling it from the back simply reverses the exact path it took to get stuck in the first place. 9 times out of 10, the lure will literally pop free instantly with almost zero physical effort. Maneuver slowly, reverse the angle completely, and get your expensive bait back quietly. Sometimes, no matter how many clever angles you try or how many shockwaves you aggressively send down the tight line, the lure is just completely and hopelessly buried. This is exactly where a dedicated heavy lure retriever comes into play. If you fish a lot of incredibly heavy cover, especially from a boat, carrying a heavy lead lure retriever is absolutely mandatory. These handy devices look like a heavy hunk of solid metal, usually weighing a few ounces to over a full pound, attached securely to a strong, thick nylon rope. They often have metal loops or small chains dangling from them. To use it, you keep your main fishing line incredibly tight, snap the heavy metal retriever directly onto your fishing line and drop it straight down into the water. The heavy weight slides very rapidly down your tight line, exactly like a fast zip line, crashing directly into your stuck lure with massive force. The sheer blunt force trauma of a heavy piece of solid lead smashing directly into your plastic crankbait is usually enough to knock it completely off the tough snag and save your day. If you do not want to spend your hard-earned money on a commercial lure retriever, or you are bank fishing and simply do not want to carry a bulky piece of lead and heavy rope in your bag, there is a legendary old-school trick you can easily use. You can quickly make a highly effective, cheap, disposable lure retriever using just an old, heavy spark plug and a large snap swivel. Take an old, useless spark plug from a car engine. Use a strong split ring to attach a heavy-duty snap swivel to the top metal terminal of the spark plug. Keep 3 or 4 of these cheap contraptions in your tackle box at all times. When you get a truly nasty snag that you absolutely cannot pop free, simply clip the snap swivel directly onto your main fishing line. Keep the line incredibly tight and let the heavy spark plug slide quickly down the line into the deep water. Because a spark plug is quite heavy and very aerodynamic in the water, it will slide down extremely fast and hit your stuck lure with a very solid thud. It is a brilliant and totally effective way to knock loose stubborn crankbaits from rocky bottoms. Fishing in a moving river introduces a completely different, highly challenging element to un-snagging your favorite lure. That element is the relentless power of the moving current. In a local pond, the water is mostly static and calm, but in a river, the heavy water flow is constantly pushing aggressively against your line and your bait. When you get completely stuck in a fast river, the current is actually working actively against you, pinning the lure much harder against the rock. The water pressure alone can make a simple snag feel completely immovable. But you can brilliantly use this fast current to your advantage if you know what you are doing. If you are stuck downstream, pulling straight back is fighting both the wood and the heavy current. Instead, you need to let out a huge amount of loose, slack line. I'm talking about stripping 20 or 30 yards of loose line off your reel and letting the fast current carry it in a massive loop far downstream of the snag. Once that big belly of line is drifting below the snag, you suddenly sweep your rod very hard in the upstream direction. The water pressure grabs the line and violently yanks the lure backward. There is another incredibly clever technique for snags that are relatively close to you, let us say, within 20 or 30 feet of your rod tip. It is quite similar to the bow and arrow technique, but it is effectively called the plucking method. This specific trick works best when you are using heavy braided line because of its complete and total lack of stretch. Reel down until your braided line is completely tight and your rod tip is hovering just about 1 foot away from the surface of the water. Grab the tight line very firmly with your bare hand just in front of the reel. Now elevate the rod tip slightly to put a solid bend in the rod. With your other free hand, reach up and violently pluck the tight line right in front of the first rod guide, exactly like you are aggressively plucking a thick, heavy bass guitar string. Pluck it extremely hard so it loudly twangs. Because braided line has absolutely zero stretch, that sharp, very high-frequency vibration travels instantly down the line and shakes the lure at a very high speed. This intense shaking motion is incredibly effective at wiggling sharp hook points out of soft, rotten wood. A huge part of successfully retrieving any snagged lure is learning to mentally visualize exactly what you are actually stuck on underneath the dark water. You absolutely must use your sensitive rod tip as a sensory tool to identify the hidden obstacle before you wildly react. When you feel the swimming lure stop unexpectedly, do not just blindly and angrily jerk the rod. Gently lift the rod tip just 1 or 2 inches and carefully feel the subtle resistance. Does it feel very mushy and heavy like a wet sponge? You are likely completely buried in thick aquatic grass or a massive pile of dead, rotting leaves. In this case, a slow, steady, continuous heavy pull will often drag the whole clump up. Does it feel totally solid, but slightly bouncy and soft? That is usually a waterlogged tree branch. The bow and arrow technique is absolutely your best bet for wood. Does it feel like you hit a solid concrete block with zero give whatsoever? You are wedged deep into hard rocks. Dropping the rod tip and giving total, immediate slack is the absolute best first move for rocks. Learn to properly read the snag through the subtle vibrations in your rod blank. Despite your absolute best efforts, knowing all the professional tricks and carefully trying every single angle, there will inevitably be bad days when the lake simply claims total victory. The lure is permanently gone. When this unfortunate moment happens, the absolute worst thing you can do is just back up and pull blindly with the bent rod until something violently explodes. If you have finally decided you must simply break the line, you must absolutely do it the safe and correct way. Never wrap the tight line around your bare hand and pull. Modern braided lines are incredibly thin and strong, and they will easily slice right through your flesh down to the white bone. Instead, find a thick, smooth object like a wooden dowel, the thick handler of your heavy fishing net, or even a hard plastic tackle box tray. Wrap the main line securely around this solid object 4 or 5 times. Point your fishing rod completely straight down the line, totally eliminating any bend in the rod tip. Hold the reel spool tightly with your thumb and then steadily pull straight backward using your body weight. The line will safely snap at the knot. There is a very pervasive, stubborn myth among older generations of anglers that the ultimate foolproof solution to frustrating snags is simply using massive, ridiculously heavy fishing line. They will spool up their reels with 65-pound braided line and loudly claim they can just haul entire submerged trees out of the water. While very heavy line certainly helps you forcefully bend out light wire hooks on tiny lures, it is absolutely not a magic cure for snags. In fact, it actually creates new, massive problems. First, tying your bait onto thick ropes of heavy braided line completely kills the natural swimming action of your smaller, more subtle lures. You will absolutely get drastically fewer bites because the smart fish can easily see the thick line. Second, when you do get a heavy line inextricably wedged deep into a rocky crevice, safely breaking off 65-pound braid is a monumental, highly dangerous chore. You run the very real risk of pulling your entire kayak right into the dangerous rocks. Heavy line gives lazy fishermen an entirely false sense of total security. Fishing is a thoughtful game of skill, not a display of mindless brute force. If you find yourself constantly snagging and losing a ridiculous amount of lures every single trip, you desperately need to rethink the hardware on your baits. Lure manufacturers often attach massive, wide-gap treble hooks on their factory crankbaits to maximize hookups in open water. But those same big, outward-pointing hooks act exactly like sharp, grappling hooks underwater, aggressively grabbing every single tiny twig they pass by. One of the absolute best proactive moves you can make is swapping out your standard factory treble hooks for extra wide gap, short shank treble hooks. The sharp points on these specialized hooks turn slightly inward toward the metal shank. This tiny detail makes them significantly less likely to dig deeply into hard wood when they bump against it. Alternatively, if you are deliberately fishing in an absolute jungle of underwater timber, consider permanently snipping the bottom-pointing hook completely off the front treble with a pair of heavy pliers. Yes, you might unfortunately miss 1 or 2 short-striking fish over the long season, but your modified lure will bounce safely and deflect off submerged timber beautifully. We really need to deeply discuss the raw psychological aspect of getting badly snagged, because this is exactly where the real battle on the water is lost. Fishing is supposed to be highly relaxing, but there is absolutely nothing more blood-boiling than permanently losing a brand new expensive Japanese swim bait on your very third cast of the morning. When that sudden, brutal halt happens, your heart rate instantly spikes. You feel a massive flash of hot anger. That very anger is exactly what triggers the immediate, totally mindless yank of the fishing rod. To truly become a better angler, you absolutely have to train your mind just as much as your hands. You have to learn to instantly suppress that sudden surge of pure frustration. The most elite professional bass anglers in the entire world get snagged just as often as you do. The major difference is their total emotional control. They do not angrily sigh, loudly curse, or jerk the rod violently. They stay incredibly calm, they immediately drop the rod tip to give slack, and they go into a methodical checklist. They treat a bad snag as a fun puzzle to be solved, not a personal insult. Finally, the absolute best and most effective way to completely avoid the headache of un-snagging lures is to significantly refine your overall presentation and your casting accuracy. We get snagged most often when we simply cast blindly into dense cover without fully understanding the complex layout of the hidden underwater structure. Pay extremely close attention to your electronic sonar graphs, or always wear high-quality polarized sunglasses to carefully study the submerged branches. Deliberately cast your lure to the far outer edges of the heavy cover, trying to actively draw the aggressive fish out, rather than immediately bombing your expensive bait straight into the thickest, most impenetrable part of the dead tree trunk. Also choose the absolutely correct lure for the specific job. Do not throw an exposed hook jig straight into a thick, tangled tree when you absolutely should be throwing a completely weedless plastic worm. Adjust your overall tactics based on the environment. A true, seasoned master of cover fishing rarely gets hopelessly snagged because they are acutely aware of every single millimeter their lure travels through the dark water. So there you have it. The number one mistake costing you lures, money, and sanity is the instinct to pull back as hard as you can. It turns a simple bump into a deeply embedded hook. We covered how giving instant slack, mastering the bow and arrow technique, and walking the bank to change your angle can save almost any stuck bait. The biggest plot twist in all of this is that doing absolutely nothing and letting the line go completely limp is usually the most powerful move you can make. By fighting your own instincts and using simple physics instead of angry brute force, you will drastically change your entire approach to fishing heavy cover. Thank you so much for watching and learning with us today. If this video helped you understand why you have been losing so much tackle, please make sure to subscribe to the channel right now, smash that like button to help us out, and drop a comment below. What is the most expensive or sentimentally valuable fishing lure you have ever permanently left at the bottom of a lake?